Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, September 22nd, 2025, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, the show is and will always be 100% free to download, and the way that we keep it going is by relying on the support on a per-episode basis from individuals just like you. If you'd like to pledge your support, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. This week's top patrons include Chuck Blell, David J.E. Smith, Daniel Lang, Mary Neva, Joseph Lamore, Anu Bonavaj, David Compton, Brian Holden, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Ulrika Hagman, and Pasquale Gelati. Oh no, we've got a new one there, Joe Wilkinson. Oh, not new. Sorry, Joe. I just didn't see you in the drop down there. And so many more. I always do the cutoff after a certain tier, but goodness, I could keep going and just thank all of you from the bottom of my heart. All right, let's get into this week's episode. So I had the opportunity to chat once again. I actually had her on the show 6 years ago when her first book came out, and she is back, Dr. Sarah E. Hill, who is a researcher, a consultant, a writer, a scientist, a science communicator, and a professor. She actually runs a research lab at TCU as an evolutionary psychologist, where she focuses on health and relationships from an interdisciplinary perspective. So everything from evolutionary biology, psychoneuroimmunology, developmental endocrinology, and even social psychology. And she has a new book out, and it's a fascinating one. It's called The Period Brain, The New Science of Why We PMS and How to Fix It. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Sarah E. Hill. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Of course. You know, it's funny. I was looking back on the interwebs to see when exactly you were on the show last. It was the episode aired on October 14th, 2019. So when you were on the show, I was studying to become a psychologist. Since then, I have not only become a psychologist, I finished my fellowship and I'm now licensed.
Oh my
God. A lot has happened, I know.
Well, that is a lot.
A lot since we last chatted. Oh, yeah, and COVID.
Oh, yeah, that's right. And we had a pandemic.
Yeah. So I'm super curious about what's been going on with you, about the differences and kind of the changes and the new insights between when you were on the show last. We were talking about your book, This Is Your Brain on Birth Control. But now we're talking about your new book, The Period Brain, The New Science of Why We PMS and How to Fix It, a manifesto for women. So maybe before we dive into what's changed, we'll do a little review of who you are, right? So would you consider yourself an evolutionary psychologist?
Yeah, I would. Yeah,
Okay.
I got my PhD at the University of Texas at Austin, working with David Buss, who's like one of the sort of luminaries in the field of evolutionary psychology, and like one of the founding fathers of the discipline. And so my background was actually originally evolutionary biology and anthropology. And then it was through David's research and others' research that I learned that you could actually apply these principles to understand human behavior. And that was when I decided I was going to become a psychologist. And so that is my background. And so, you know, we can either call me an evolutionary psychologist. Sometimes I'm just called a research psychologist, just as a way to try to separate myself from the clinical world. Not because there's anything wrong with the clinical world, but just simply because I'm not qualified to
what we do is very, very different. Yeah,
exactly. To offer my clinical opinion. Instead, I'm a researcher at a university, and so I do experiments and that sort of thing, rather than trying to actually help people and solve their problems that way. So, that's my story.
And I should say, nor am I qualified to make sense of so much of what you share across both of your books, but I'm especially, maybe I should say a little bit selfishly, interested in this topic, not just because I'm a woman, but because of some of the things that I have experienced over the last several years, which I will share with you in just a moment because that lens is going to be, I think, an interesting lens for our chat today. But before we do that, I'm curious, how did you get into the sort of research world of studying hormones? Because often we think of that as the purview of more, I guess we could say, biology or chemistry or biomedicine. But of course, psychology, it's an area I think in psychology that we don't spend enough time in.
Yeah, no, for sure, for sure. And I mean, so if you think about using an evolutionary approach to understand behavior as being sort of the why of behavior, right? So, for
Mm,
example, why do we all experience the emotion of disgust when we see vomit? And it's
mhm,
like ultimately, it provides an adaptive function, right? It serves a function for us to experience, disgust responses and the corresponding avoid motivation that we have when we experience disgust, because it helps keep us safe from pathogens, right? So, an evolutionary approach is really good at providing like why explanations for human behavior. And a lot of my early research was really interested in, I was really interested in the why of, counterproductive behaviors. So things like risky sexual behavior. And I was also interested in just the general sort of ins and outs of partner attraction and mate choice.
mm,
And evolutionary, using an evolutionary lens is really great in that it does offer you this insight into function and the why behind behavior. And I really got interested in looking at hormones, and in my research, I also look at inflammation because it acts kind of similarly in the brain, just in terms of being part of the how of behavior, right? So if we think about evolution as the why, hormones and what's going on neurobiologically in the brain, that's telling you how it works, right?
mhm,
It's telling you about what the mechanisms are. And so I really got interested in hormones because it's like, I'd always had a deep interest in why we do the things that we do. But you can also learn a lot about the why we do the things that we do when we understand the biological constraints that it's operating in and understand the how. And
mm,
so, I got really interested in looking at, the way that the different mechanisms in the body generate things like attraction and this sort of thing. And that, of course, is going to take you down a rabbit hole that ultimately lands on hormones. But also, it was my personal experiences of being on hormonal birth control and then going off of it that really made me appreciate the profound effect that our sex hormones have on the how of behavior,
yeah,
right? Because I
yeah,
didn't really, even though I'd always had an awareness, and I'd even published some papers looking at the role of women's sex hormones on different types of motivational states related to partner attraction. But I didn't really spend too much time, like, really like interested in the deep and foundational ways that hormones shape our reality, like I said, until I went off the pill. And then it was like, as I write in that book, that first book, This Is Your Brain on Birth Control, that for me it felt like I was climbing out of a two-dimensional black and white drawing into a three-dimensional, beautiful color-filled reality. It
mhm,
just totally changed my experience of being a human. And that's what really got me into, appreciating the foundational role that hormones play in terms of creating our psychological experiences. And then, so I dug, my first book, of course, was the rabbit hole I went into when I was interested in hormonal birth control and how that shifts our, the way that we think, feel, and experience the world. And then with the new book, with the period brain, it's understanding this with respect to women's naturally cycling hormones and how does that influence the way that women, experience life
yeah.
as a woman.
And I think about, I'm a cis woman. I, had my first period kind of late. It was like the month before I turned 16. You have this period in your life where you uh, sort of don't have a lot of insight into that aspect of your experience. Then you try to understand it as it's starting to happen. It's not, I think this idea of like normal is something that has probably screwed with a lot of us from a very young age, that there's some sort of like prototypical experience that we're supposed to have or way that we're supposed to feel. And if anything is outside of that, I think a lot of women are kind of scared to talk about it, or they often will think, oh, well, it's not supposed to be fun. So if I don't complain, everybody kind of goes through this and it's pretty horrible. But I think that
Mhm.
there are a lot of people who might have diagnosable illnesses, who might have experiences that are extreme that might be normalizing them. And then vice versa, there may be people who, think that there's a concept of normal, but when there's a lot of natural variability, right?
Oh yeah, there's natural variability in any trait that you can measure. I mean, even,
Hmm.
something as foundational as sexual desire, and opposite sex attraction, which obviously from an evolutionary perspective, you expect that the sort of modal response is going to be heterosexual sexual attraction and a desire to have sex. But there's a lot of variability in that. And
Hmm.
evolution by selection actually intentionally creates that variability, right? And so there's nothing unusual or abnormal about sort of non-typical responses to things. And instead, the lack of biological consensus on anything is almost always baked into the system, just simply because the evolutionary process requires variability in order to
Right.
work. And so it intentionally creates variability with sexual reproduction. And so there's always going to be variability in traits. And I think that understanding that, I think is a really important thing for everyone to understand, especially when they're considering science and medical advice and other types of things that they get, where they assume that if the drug is supposed to work this way, it's going to work this way in me, or if
Hmm.
hormones do this, that they're going to do this in me, or this is normal and this is not normal. And a lot of times none of those things are true. There's a way, there's an average response to a drug, or there's an average response to hormonal changes, and there's an average expression of sexuality, and there's an average, but those are just averages. And
Yeah.
ultimately, variability is always there. And if you don't sort of fit into the cookie cutter ideals out there about what's normal and how things are supposed to be, instead of feeling marginalized, it's like, because of course people will try to make you feel that way. Embrace, it's like, that's like part of what makes us human, is that not, we're not always going to fit in the lines of biology.
Absolutely. And even the concept, I think, of, I mean, not just normal, which is sort of a loaded term, but even the concept of average, or the concept of within the lines, or the concept of a cookie cutter, or measure of central tendency, which sounds almost like beyond it, it's statistical, it's scientific, it's true, and it cannot be challenged. But the more we understand about how we do science, the more we understand about sort of the cultural pressures and the zeitgeist that we're living in, the more we understand that even our concepts of things like normalcy are completely influenced by who we choose to do research with, who's doing the research, how are they interpreting the results. Like there's kind of no real, yes, there is a reality out there, of course, but everything we're trying to do always is to better approximate it and to measure it better and better, but it's still people doing that, right? So we're always a little bit off.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, 100%. 100%. Yes.
And I think that's like an important concept to remember when we sit down with a physician, or we sit down with some information, and we can't help, right? We're human beings, so there's like this inherent narcissism that we all have, where we are the actor in our own play, and we can't help but like constantly compare ourselves to whatever this standard appears to be, or this normative thing appears to be. And I think that can lead to, just like you talked about, it can lead to othering of individuals, but it can lead to a lot of internal, I guess, discomfort and strife and confusion when, I feel different at different times of the month. I feel different on different months. I feel different because of a lot of different variables. And it's sometimes super hard to understand myself. And I think or I hope, at least that's my read, is that the more we understand the foundational biology, and not just, hey, as regular consumers, we want to understand what the scientists know, but also the more that scientists are understanding it in a deeper and more nuanced way, I think the more accepting we may become of ourselves, the happier we are, the more comfortable we are in our own skin.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that there is a tendency for any of us, right? When we are told like this is how things are and this is how things are supposed to be, and then if we don't exactly fit into that snapshot of normal, that it can either create anxiety or, as you sort of noted, like self-loathing, right? Where you
Mm,
feel you feel like you don't fit, right? And
yeah.
and it makes us feel bad about ourselves. But the fact is, even like I said, for things that are as sort of evolutionarily derived as something like sexual attraction, you get a bunch of really beautiful variability, and all of that is normal, and all
Mm.
of that is to be expected. And recognizing that that's part of our biological story as a species, is the generation of variability. And I think that in some ways, it's also useful to think about when we start to talk about differences between the sexes. And, when I talk about sex, I'm talking about it as a biologist and just talking about somebody based on the size of gametes they produce.
Mhm.
So talking about biologically, like, do you produce sperm or do you produce eggs? And the reason that in biology we tend to talk about sex based on the size of somebody's sex cells is just because that does provide a foundation by which you begin to see sex-based specialization in developmental processes, and just simply meaning that if you are a biological female, which of course doesn't mean that you also have to be gendered a female, because sex
Mhm.
matters and gender matters. But rather, if you are somebody who's a biological female, then that means that you have the greater obligatory investment in reproduction, right? So if you're a biological female, it means if you're going to have a baby, that you're going to be the one who invests more
Of course,
in that
yeah.
baby than a biological male, and that produces sex differences in the need to compete. So that leads to sex differences in aggression. That leads to sex differences in the costs of making a bad mating decision, because of course for a biological female that could, a bad mating choice could result in having to maintain a minimum of a 9-month investment that you don't want, at least
Mhm.
historically, before we had access to things like contraception. And essentially, it lays the groundwork for sex differentiated adaptive challenges, which leads to sex differentiation in a lot of different processes in the body, including the fact that women have 2 primary sex hormones and that men have 1. Right.
Yeah.
And this ends up, creating these distinct biological experiences for people who are biologically female and biologically male, that can really, I think, be enlightening to people who've experienced them. And in some ways, just to sort of speak to the idea of, you sort of like whether you're biologically male or female from birth, based or whether, you make a change there. It's funny because when you talk about the impact of hormones and, their sweeping effects on the way that we experience the world, there's nobody who's more attuned to this than people who are transsexual and going through
Mhm.
hormone therapy. Because if you've talked to folks who've experienced kind of both sides of the sex hormone coin, they have really interesting stories about all of the different ways that their experiences of the world differed just on
Yeah.
the basis of sex hormones. And so it's, again, it's really, when we think about the way, and like sort of again, just sort of the average differences that we see between individuals of different categories or individuals of different sexes. It's always talking about these things in terms of averages. And, on average, biological females, this, and on average, biological males, that. But of course, that doesn't mean that that is anyhow, like supposed to be diagnostic or indicative that there's something more, natural, like about you if you sort of fall in the norm or the average of a, expression of a trait. Like that's no better or worse than something that falls outside the lines. And
Right.
and I think that there is a misunderstanding that exists with especially people trying to understand biology, that anything that isn't sort of the normative expression of a trait is somehow less natural than something that is normative, like just
Yeah.
meaning that it's the average. And
Yeah,
that's
it's a logical
true.
fallacy, right? That just because something is somehow, quote, normal, that it's somehow better or more moral, or that's the way it's supposed to be. It's
Right.
and
Yeah.
we fall victim to that all the time.
Yeah, no, for sure. And especially like, it's not even, it's also not more natural, just
Mhm.
because you sort of fall in the average, trait expression. So for example, I'm a cisgendered, heterosexual, woman with kids, right? And just because that sort of is, the normative pattern, that doesn't mean that my way of being is any more natural than
Yeah.
somebody who's transgendered or who
Mhm.
has, same-sex sexual attraction. That's not any less natural than heterosexuality or being cisgendered. It's just different.
Right.
But they're both natural, because they're both something that are created by the act of sexual reproduction, and that is the creation of variability. And we have that in every trait.
Yeah, and the truth is we also have no idea when it comes to things that are, less genetically, shall I say, mappable. We have no idea how much our societal norms, affect the decisions, not even decisions, that's not even a good way to put it, but the tendencies that we have. Like, I am a cisgender bisexual woman who doesn't have children,
Mhm.
and often it is, I feel the pressure that, like, societally having children is normative, right? And not having children is aberrant or abnormal. We have no idea if I naturally, quote unquote,
Right.
would have been drawn to one thing versus the other, because you can't tease those variables. It's impossible to do those kinds of experiments. Like,
Yeah,
we
no.
live in a world with a society and with culture and with patriarchy and with all these different pressures that we feel, right? And with gender norms that are, you know, rooted in our biology and that are also wildly far from our biology, and they're all intermixing and playing on each other all the time.
Yeah, no, 100%. No, it's almost impossible to tease apart the biological and the cultural contributions to any type of a phenotype. Period.
Yeah, especially something as complicated as, like, sexual attraction, or, things that, like, aren't like, gene to expression, I guess, diagnosable concerns. Like, when we're talking about characteristics of an individual, like, not just a phenotype, like one individual, thing that I can point to and map back to the gene, but like things about my personality. I mean, that's so complex. That's probably hundreds of genes, thousands of genes, plus all of my experiences, plus all of the pressures on me in society. You
Yeah,
you
no,
just you can't
exactly.
tease those things apart. So I'm curious. I mentioned before I wanted to bring up a scenario, and I don't want to take too much time away from your insights because that's why we're here. But as a framework for you, and I guess for the listener who hasn't, been with me week to week over the last several years, just to share a little bit. And I probably shared a tiny slice of this in 2019, but much has changed. Um, I had been on birth control since I was 16. I had to go off birth control in 2022 because I was diagnosed with adenocarcinoma in situ, which is like an early stage of cervical cancer. And the treatment for that is total hysterectomy, because unfortunately you can't just remove the cervix, you have to remove the uterus with the cervix, right? That's just how it
Right.
works. So I underwent total hysterectomy, but I kept my ovaries. They often take out the fallopian tubes as well because they are they're not at all useful with no uterus. And we now understand that leaving them in place is just a reservoir for potential cancer later on in life. So it's normative now to remove the fallopian tubes, but the ovaries, which are very necessary for all of this stuff that we're talking about, all of these different
Right.
hormones. There was nothing going on. There was no concerns with my ovaries, so they're left in place, right? So I don't have to go through early menopause. I didn't have to start HRT, anything like that. So now, cut to it's 2025. I'm a few years now post hysterectomy. I'm no longer on birth control because I also had a blood clot, and so nobody will give me birth control anymore. And I
Right.
had a period post hysterectomy that nobody warned me about, where I had these wild, sad, periods and these like intense experiences with my mood. And of course, I was just saying, oh, it's because I had cancer. Oh, it's because I just went through this horrible surgery. And then I realized one day, I think I'm on my period, and I have no idea how to know if I'm on my period
Right.
because I don't bleed anymore, but all the hormones are still in me cycling. So that's when I started testing them. And
Oh,
I got one of these kits where you pee on a stick and it tests your FSH and your LH, and it tests 4 different hormones. Oh, and your estrogen and your progesterone. And I do daily testing, and I've mapped out my cycle over several months now, and it's been fascinating how 1-to-1 in hindsight it is between my progesterone and how I feel.
that's fascinating. That's fascinating.
1-to-1. And now I know, now I'm having my what would have been considered a menstrual cycle. Here I'm in my, luteal phase. I'm premenstrual. This is when I feel the absolute worst. Here I'm in my follicular phase. I'm kind of doing great. Now I'm ovulating. Everything is A-okay. And just how that cycle I did it out of order. Sorry. So follicular, ovulating, then luteal, then on my period, and that cycle going back and back and back. I feel like crap when I'm in my luteal phase. And it's just so obvious to me now. My whole life, I'm 41. That's 40 years before not understanding that about myself.
Yeah, wow, that's just crazy. That's crazy. I'm
Yeah.
glad that you started measuring your hormones.
I wish we all could afford. I know it's a privilege to be able to do this because it's not cheap to do, but now at least there are consumer products that allow you to do it. But I wish we all had this capability at a young age so that we could better understand ourselves early.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, it's like our hormonal changes have such a sweeping impact on the way that we experience the world and the way we experience ourselves. And it is not something that we talk about, And I think that part of this is because, for a very long time, women were made to feel like inferior versions of men because we
Yeah.
have hormones that cycle. And so then it became sort of taboo to really say anything about our hormones and our cycles because it was essentially seen as a sign of weakness. And but the result of that, unfortunately, has been that a lot of us have dismissed and trivialized the important role that they have in creating the experiences that we have as a human. And that's hard, right? Because when you're experiencing the things that you're experiencing, I mean, it can make you feel like you're losing your mind. And now you have had this edifying experience of measuring your hormones, which, many women don't have, again, as you noted, the ability to do it is kind of expensive. It really is insightful in helping you understand and be able to anticipate and communicate about the way that we're experiencing the world, because there are women out there in the world who are very similar to you, who they just have a bad time when progesterone is on the scene. And for some women, it can occur the entirety of the luteal phase where they feel really terrible and sad. And so anytime that progesterone makes its appearance, they are not feeling great. And then there are other women who have the experience of just feeling bad when it's falling. And so during the late luteal phase, right before you get your period, or in your case, not get your period,
Uh-huh.
but with your hormones changing, and and this is valuable to know. And I'm sure that knowing this, like, well, and this, here's a question for you. What have you done? Like, what has this done for you? If
Yeah,
any.
it's helped with a lot of things, I think. I mean, and one clarification for me, which I probably didn't even say, what I'm starting to understand, although I haven't done enough cycles to really dial into it, is that when I'm luteal, so that's that phase between ovulating and my period, and when I'm ovulating, I feel awesome. And then when I'm in that luteal phase, my progesterone is like, when you look at the chart, it's like a W over and over. It's just like wildly up and down and up and down. It has huge swings. And so, and that's just my cycle, right? That's when my progesterone is all over the place. And so I have no idea if it's because it's rising that I feel bad or because it's dipping that I feel bad, because it feels to me, or it seems to me like it's actually just the change, the really drastic change that affects me so negatively, because it's pretty consistent, the rises and falls the rest of the month, or it's just like consistently low. So anyway, what do I do about it? Well, it's completely changed the way my partner and I communicate about how I'm feeling. He really, when he can see it on a map, when he can literally see a chart, he's like, oh, no wonder, like, how could you not feel different? I mean, look at yesterday versus today. Look at, how could you not be a little bit more irritable, or a little bit more, just like restless or depressed? So it's really important, I think, to have a visual manifestation of something that is ineffable for most of us. It's just this, like, I don't know, this like wiggly feeling inside of us. But when you can see it on paper, I mean, it's not technically on paper, it's on my iPhone, but you know what I mean? When you can see it, it's like, it not that it makes it more real, but it reinforces and kind of validates the experience that you're having. And so in a lot of ways, how has it affected me? It's given me permission to feel my feelings, to
Mhm.
be accepting of how I'm feeling. It's given others around me, like my partner, permission to be, kinder, softer, gentler at certain times of the month, or just, more open about communication around those things. And also to cut myself some slack if I'm like not as horny, or if I'm, like, I don't want to be touched right now. Please don't sleep so close to me tonight. It sort of makes sense.
Yeah, no, and I think that for a lot of people it can be exactly those things, right? I think that it's
Mm,
it's very validating, and I think that understanding what your body is doing. And so just to give you an example, one of the things that women report during the luteal phase is that they feel sort of keyed up emotionally and in a little bit of anxiety, and that
mm,
this anxiety can then lead them to lash out, right?
mm,
They're quicker to identify problems, right?
yeah.
And one of the reasons for this is that our brain, because our body is preparing for pregnancy, and this is a very vulnerable time in a woman's life, historically, women were very much dependent on their partners for resources and protection, especially during pregnancy, when, of course, women are less able to get around and run away. And because of this, we are wired to have our brain lower the threshold on what is considered a threat in
Mm,
response to progesterone, right? So it actually changes the amount of data that has to come in that suggests that there's a threat before our amygdala starts communicating with the other parts of our brain that there might be a problem.
yeah.
And it's important, like, if you understand that, and like, okay, your brain is sort of shifting into protection, like rest and protect, mode. I think it's really helpful to know that about yourself, and then also be able to have conversations with yourself, and then
Mhm.
conversations with partners about what's going on, right? Because I
Yeah.
know in my own life that knowing everything that I do about hormones and hormonal shifts and my emotional responses to things, it doesn't always save me from losing my mind, right?
Yeah,
When
yeah,
um,
for
when
sure.
things aren't
Yeah, I'm
going
still just as irritable. Just because I know I'm irritable doesn't mean I'm
right.
less irritable.
Right, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, and so it's like and the same is true for me, right? But I'm able to talk myself out of going into an anxiety loop. Sort of understanding
Mhm.
that my brain is sounding alarm bells more easily is helpful to me. And it's also
Yeah.
really helpful to me, like, after, if I do have a moment where I'm not on my best behavior, because of this shift in my perceptual sort of my perception, I am quicker to have a conversation with whoever it is, usually my partner, that I that I have the response to. And,
Yeah.
and it's like, and we've had enough conversations about this stuff now over the years that, I mean, it's been just absolutely incredibly, I can't even tell you how helpful it's been, because he doesn't react. He does, if he knows what's going on, he doesn't react because he knows what is happening hormonally.
Hmm.
And so he doesn't see my behavior as being a referendum on the relationship. Right. And
Right.
instead understands that, that my brain is a little bit trigger happy with threat, and just sort of just let me cool down and then have a conversation with me, and figure out what's actually happening. And the same with the sexual desire. Like you said, it's like sexual desire is also cyclical for women, and most women, but again, not all, because there's error bars in every single thing I can possibly tell you about cycles.
Hmm.
And many women experience higher sexual desire near ovulation, and then feel lower sexual desire in the luteal phase when progesterone is on the scene. And again, this is very functional, because sex is not only metabolically expensive, because of course, it takes a lot of work,
Hmm.
but also it is, physiologically costly in that it creates an inflammatory response near the cervix, which isn't necessarily a good idea in what is known as the implantation window. And so you
Hmm.
do get this like reduction in sexual desire that's, supposed to function to help minimize inflammatory activity in that area during a time when implantation can occur. And knowing that about yourself, and again, being able to communicate this with partners, especially if you have a male partner who doesn't cycle, I
Right.
mean, it's incredibly useful. Because again, most men have no idea. It's like they have a circadian rhythmicity to their hormonal shifts, right? Where they have higher testosterone in the morning than they do later in the day. But essentially, every day is the same day hormonally for them,
Yeah.
and they're not cyclical. And for most men, if they're experiencing a sharp decline in sexual desire, it means there's a problem, right? But
Hmm.
and it's not that way for us, but they don't know that. And
Yeah.
sometimes we get so trapped in our own psychology that it becomes difficult to understand what we need to communicate about. And I think that, and a lot of times, women are told this stuff about themselves, right? They think that there's something wrong with them
Well,
because
yeah, that's the thing. Like men don't know it. Most women don't know. Like that's the really difficult part. It's kind of like we always say in clinical psychology, first comes insight, then comes action. It's very hard to have, healthy communication or to make decisions or to affect change if you don't even understand what is going on with yourself. So for a lot of women, I think it's just a crapshoot. It's like, why do I feel like crap today? Why do I feel so horny today? Why do I have all this energy? Why do I feel like I can't get out of bed? And it just, because I think that cycle is so long, right? It's a monthly cycle, but it's not a perfect month either. And for some women, it's longer, and for some women, it's shorter. So sometimes it's hard to map it to a calendar because it drifts over the course of the year. It's very hard unless you're actually doing the analysis, unless you're measuring or noting certain things in your calendar, and unless you have a pretty regular cycle, you may have no idea why you feel the way you feel. Add to that our lack of education about all these things we've been talking about. I mean, we've been talking about it as if it's a known thing, the difference, but maybe we should actually take a quick second for everybody listening and remind them what these different phases of the cycle are.
Right. Yeah, no, and as you noted, I mean, this is something that most people aren't ever taught. And so
Mhm.
I think, yes, it is useful to go through. And so for somebody who has a cycle, the first day of your cycle is the day that you get your period. And that makes it a really easy thing to make note of, unless you're you. In
Yeah,
which
yeah.
case,
So now it's the day that my little machine and my app tell me that I got my period, which for
right.
me, I'm very lucky because it happens to be the first day of the month.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
I
Yeah.
know, so it's like every calendar drawing of a woman's cycle is my cycle.
I love that. That's
Yeah,
awesome. That makes
yeah,
it super easy.
yeah.
So the first day of the cycle is the day that your period starts. And at that point, your hormone levels are actually super low. And the thing that actually prompts the shedding of the endometrial lining is the fact that hormones kind of crash during this time. And having these really low levels of hormone is something that then tells the brain that it's time to start stimulating some egg follicles. And as the egg follicles start to get stimulated, they release estrogen. And so estrogen begins to be released and it starts to increase. And a lot of times women will feel this starting around day 5 or 6 of the cycle, which is generally a time after which bleeding has stopped. And women start to feel a little bit more energetic, a little bit more outgoing, and just, feeling more comfortable in their skin, which is, these are all effects that estrogen tends to have on the female brain and the body. Is like it tends to make us feel good. And estrogen, as egg follicles are developing and ultimately as one is chosen and it fully develops, this leads to rising levels of estrogen. And estrogen levels rise across the first part of the menstrual cycle. And really that rising of estrogen really starts to hit a fever pitch, generally around day 9 or so of the cycle, where things really start to increase rapidly until the time of ovulation, which generally happens around day 14. Right. So during this period, which is known as the fertile window, this day 9 to 14, this is the period of time when women's estrogen levels are highest across the cycle. And it's also a time in the cycle during which sex can lead to conception. And because of this, because our brain is no dummy, right? And we have inherited traits from our successful ancestors who managed to have sex and have babies and pass down traits. This is a time during the cycle in which most women have their highest within cycle levels of sexual desire. So sexual desire goes up. Women tend to have more sex. They feel sexier. They dress sexier. They move sexier. Their voices sound sexier. They smell sexier. Essentially, their whole body and brain is oriented toward attraction and sex. Because, of course, this is a time when sex can lead to conception. And, of course, we have inherited this tendency to roll out the red carpet on all things sex and attraction at times when this trait can get passed down. And so that's what we tend to see during the first half of the cycle. And we call that half of the cycle the follicular phase of the cycle. And it includes, again, that period of time when hormone levels are low and then estrogen levels rising and then ovulation. After ovulation, which again usually happens around day 14, so usually about 2 weeks after the day you got your period, at that point, the empty egg follicle actually becomes a temporary endocrine structure that's called the corpus luteum. And this empty, this temporary structure starts releasing women's second primary sex hormone, progesterone. And as progesterone begins, so progesterone starts getting released, usually around day 15 of the cycle, you're getting relatively high levels of progesterone and it starts to climb. And during this phase of the cycle, essentially your body is preparing for the possibility of implantation. So in case that egg that you just released becomes fertilized, it's preparing for the possibility of that implantation event. And so there's a lot of differentiation of tissue going on in the endometrium. So preparing for implantation that way. The body is also shifting gears in a lot of different ways to prepare for implantation in terms of suppressing the immune system, which of course you don't want attacking an embryo that's trying to implant because immune systems like to go after things that are genetically non-similar to the self, making an embryo a good candidate for something the immune system should kill. The immune system will turn down the volume on it, so that way it doesn't go after an embryo. We become sleepier because the hormone progesterone actually sort of turns down the volume on external sources of pleasure. So we sort of become a little bit more interior and have less ability or even interest in like sort of outward gain seeking behaviors. Like, we don't feel like going out and going dancing with our friends as much as we do in the earlier phases of the cycle because progesterone sort of turns down the volume on the expected pleasure that we'll get from these types of activities. It tends to make us sleepier. Again, it tends to lower the threshold on what our brain is willing to consider a threat because we're in this like heightened vulnerable state. And so progesterone is getting our brain on the lookout for the signs of possible danger, right? It's lowering our sexual desire as a way to minimize inflammatory activity in the vaginal canal and near the cervix, right? It's also increasing our appetite because progesterone increases our need for, like, it increases our caloric need um, between about 7 and 11%. So
Mm,
women in the luteal phase of the cycle need an additional like 150 to almost 200 calories a day, because their body is working harder during this time to prepare for the possibility of pregnancy. And that is something that raises our basal metabolic rate. It increases our body temperature. It increases our respiration rate. So we tend to breathe more heavily, more deeply, and more frequently. And
wow.
all of these things are happening as our body is transitioning itself from being a body that is optimized for attraction and sex into a body that's optimized for implantation and pregnancy, right? And it's these experiences of these hormonal shifts that are responsible for these cycle-based changes in the way that women think and feel and experience themselves and the world around them. And it's the fact that so many of us aren't told anything about any of this,
Right.
that so many of us feel so confused. And I think a lot of times end up feeling like our body is the enemy because we feel like it's standing in the way of doing the things that we want because we don't understand what it's actually trying to do. Right? Like we don't
Right.
understand why we feel so tired during the last 2 weeks of the cycle or why we feel so hungry and we think that we have no self-control and that we have no discipline. But the fact is our body is shifting gears, right? And we actually need to spend a little bit more restorative time. And it would be positive to take in more calories. But because we aren't told this information, right, instead we just feel like there's something wrong with us, which I think
Yeah.
is a lot of times the story in women's health. It's just this idea that there's these ways of being that our body has that aren't something that's been very well articulated by science and isn't something that's well articulated to women or articulated at all. And then the result is that we just feel like there's something wrong with us, and why won't our body just do the things that it's supposed to be doing?
Well, and also this idea that when it is articulated, very often it is the butt of sort of the cultural joke, right? And so, and that I think is what kind of messed with me and
Mhm.
filled me with myth that then needed to be debunked more than just having, it's like the Dunning-Kruger thing. Like nobody
Mhm.
really has an empty mind. You have a mind full of like misinformation, and it's much harder to knock that out with
Mhm.
correct information. And so I think because I grew up in a culture where from the time I was small, the butt of the joke on every sitcom and in every household was, oh, she's on her period, that's why she's acting crazy, or oh, she's on her
Right.
period, that's why she's crying. I kind of thought that most of these hormonal changes happen when you're on your period. And I never understood that whole concept of PMS. I was on birth control since I was 16 until I got off of it for my surgery, which means that I had pretty level hormones until that off week. And so I was like, I feel like crap on my period. Everybody says you're supposed to. I always do. I have cramps. But I never understood that feeling of being in the luteal phase before. And now that I get that, I'm like, oh, it's not that those 4 days or 5 days that the app is telling me I'm on my period. It's everything leading up to that I feel horrible. Like that's when I feel the worst. And I know it's different for different people, but I was never that was never communicated to me. And I always thought that like PMS, premenstrual syndrome, or
Mhm.
PMDD, premenstrual disorder, were like almost misnomers.
Right. Yeah, it's funny because when you're on the pill, generally the time that women feel the worst is when they're bleeding.
Uh-huh.
And so I think that we also have sort of a little bit of a skewed perception of what that is if we were pill takers. So I was on the
Mhm.
pill, and I very much had that experience of the worst week being the week that I had my period. And the reason for this is that your hormones crash, during that time.
Mhm.
And if you're somebody who's on the pill, you're used to getting the same hormonal message every single day. And then all of a sudden having a hormone crash, it feels crazy. Like you,
Yeah.
you don't
Yeah.
feel right. You don't feel like yourself. And so
And I
it's this,
wasn't even on the pill. I was on the ring, which means I had really the same hormonal message 24/7 until I
yeah,
took out the ring, and then I crashed hard.
right. And then you crash hard. And
Yeah.
it's that sensitivity to those hormonal changes that can make women feel really bad. And a lot of times, women who have really bad PMS or even PMDD during the premenstrual time, which is the time that naturally cycling women generally feel the worst. That's also believed to be, at least based on the research, the result of sensitivity to hormonal changes. And here, the luteal phase, a natural luteal phase, is a time of tremendous hormonal change. So even though we've all seen that little drawing of the menstrual cycle that shows the two little bumps of hormones, right? That little bump of estrogen in the first half of the cycle, and then that comparably sized bump of progesterone in the second half of the cycle, that's actually not drawn to scale. And the levels of progesterone peak at levels that are 10 times higher than levels of estrogen. Right. And, so
and not everybody's is a smooth bump. Like I was saying, mine looks like a big extended W. It's like up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, the whole luteal phase.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. And so you get whenever you have wild hormonal swings, for people who are sensitive to hormonal changes, those big swings can really create issues. And a lot of that is that we do tend to lack cellular plasticity and resilience to hormonal changes just because of some of the changes we've made in our environments. As our sleep has eroded, as our social networks have eroded, as our healthy eating has eroded, right? As our movement and exercise has eroded, this too has had the effect of eroding our resilience to hormonal changes. And it makes it where our cells are less able to quickly adapt to the wild changes in hormones. And that also causes wild changes in things like neurotransmission, and lacking the ability to really quickly adapt to those wild swings is one of the reasons that some women experience those times much harder or much worse than other women, right? And so there's also things that we can do just by, improving on some of our dietary and lifestyle, related activities. So doing things that just promote some of the general pillars of physical health are also going to increase our resilience to hormonal changes and minimize the negative impact that hormonal changes can have on the way that we feel.
Yeah. And I think also, beyond what we can do to, I guess, mitigate, like you mentioned, just understanding and accepting has a huge psychological mitigation, right? You may feel the way you feel. There may be nothing you can do. You can probably soften it a little bit, but ultimately there may be, nothing we can do to not feel the way that we feel. And that's okay. And
Right.
just knowing that that's okay is a big deal.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, yes, yes, and yes. Understanding all of that, and I think is really the key to developing a better relationship with ourselves, because I think that so many women have felt, just like I think you said, you've had this experience of feeling like there is something. I mean, it's just like the butt of a joke, right? Like a butt of a joke culturally is, oh, ha ha ha, you're on your period. Even though, as noted, the period is a time when your hormone levels are at their literal lowest, And so the idea that we're too hormonal during this time is just absolutely false.
Yeah, they're at their lowest and they're relatively flat during that time too. They're not doing a whole lot. And so it's like their lowest and I'm pretty stable right now.
Right. And so it's like, well, maybe we're just not hormonal enough.
Yeah. That's so funny.
And so, which, is its own thing. And so, I think that, one of the things that we need to do as women is that we need to let go of this idea that there's something pathological or less than or problematic about the fact that our hormone cycle. Because the fact is, the only reason that we think that there's anything wrong with it is just because our understanding of what it means to be human and what it means to be normal, for the most part, has been derived from research conducted on men.
Yeah, so by men on men.
About men. And that has anchored our expectations about what it means to be normal and what is desirable. And, if women were studied first, you could imagine a universe where a woman with cycling hormones would look at the male way of being and say, like, what's wrong with this? It's too simple. Like, how could you possibly make a good decision when you can only look at things through one lens? I can look at things through two lenses, right? And so how could I possibly trust you as a president, with this very simplified view of the, it's, but it really, we need to rethink the idea that there's something wrong with the hormone changes, because there isn't,
No,
and we
it's
know,
it's
and
what's supposed to happen.
it's like
Yeah.
what's supposed to happen. And and it's the same. Men have hormones that cycle too. They just cycle on a 24-hour clock instead of a monthly clock. And their hormones, as they change, also influence how they think and feel and experience themselves in the world. And there's nothing wrong with that. And it's part of the inherited wisdom that we have, right? That we've inherited from our ancestors who managed to be able to survive. And
Yeah.
each one of us embodies these traits that have been handed down to us for millions of years. And if even one of our direct ancestors failed to reproduce, we wouldn't be here. And so there's a lot of wisdom in those traits. And so I think that it's
Absolutely.
yeah, so it's time that I think we really need to work on, just changing the narrative around hormonal changes and recognizing that there isn't anything inherently wrong, less than, or problematic about the fact that they cycle.
Absolutely. And I mean, one last thing that comes to mind, and I guess after this, if there's anything you'd like to add, please do, before we close out the hour. But one thing that comes to mind is I think back to when I was a teenager. I think back to all of the different times that I heard, again, the butts of the joke. Oh, she's on her period. Oh, it's because she's bleeding. Oh, it's that time of the month. Aunt Flo is here. Like, there was this, I guess, idea in my mind, and I can imagine that a lot of other people thought this way and or still think this way, that it's the cramping, it's the physical bleeding, it's the actual blood in the underwear that is what's making women not feel well during these times, right? That it's the
Right.
physical act. And yes, cramps can hurt. And yes, some women have a lot of pain that's associated with their periods, but that is a separate phenomenon from what is happening hormonally. And I think that to conflate the two does us a real disservice because it puts all of the onus. And I think it goes back to this idea you said, science has been by men for men for so long, and they literally still think about our periods in like a pre-dark ages way, like blood leave body must make crazy. And it's like, that
Yes.
is not what is happening here. And I think the more we can put those thoughts aside and think more sophisticatedly about what's physically happening, coursing through our bodies are these hormones, that are developed in our brain, that are released in different organs in our body, and that have, broad effects across so many things, not just our mood, not just our psychology, but our actual biochemistry, our actual, organ function. If we start thinking in that way and move away from that very simplified and honestly, like, come on, guys, like an old school perception, blood make her crazy. But
Yeah.
that's how I thought for so long, because that's what I was taught to think.
Yeah, no, it is so crazy because yes, there is very much this belief that that the blood issue is like the time when we have the biggest problems, and and everything is different. And no, and it's, yeah, and it's just not the way that it happens for most people. For most women, this is not the story, right? The
Yeah, and
story.
it took me not bleeding to realize that. I no longer have menstrual cramps because I don't have the organ that would cramp. I no longer have physical blood during my period to really realize, okay, I've been able to successfully remove that variable, and now I can clearly see my experience as a person, going through these hormonal cycles every month. And I think most women, you don't have that opportunity. It is all conflated. And why wouldn't it be when you're reminded by literally every man in your life, when you're reminded by every TV show, every movie, every, pop culture reference that, oh, you're bleeding. And so that's why you're acting like this.
Yeah, yeah, no, I know. It's yes, it is like from the dark ages.
It really is. Like when you think of it. And I think that I never really stopped to think about that until this very conversation, that it's such a, like old school way of thinking. And so I'm curious, Sarah, I know we're running low on time. Obviously, there's a million things we didn't talk about, but is there anything that you can think of? We talked about This Is Your Brain on Birth Control several years ago. Folks can go back and listen to that episode. But the period brain, anything that you can think of that we didn't touch on that you think is important for folks to know? I mean, actually, we did cover a lot, didn't we?
Yeah, we really did. I think that we did a really nice job of covering many of the main topics. But the takeaway message is you're hormonal, right? And there's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with being hormonal. And it is part of the wisdom that is baked into the system from, millions of years of successful reproduction by our ancestors. And the only reason that it's seen as problematic is because men and the male understanding of the body came first. And so
Mhm.
that's one. Two, you are a different version of yourself when when your body is under control of estrogen than when it's under the control of progesterone.
Yeah.
And understanding those shifts is really step one in terms of helping you feel a whole lot better. And then lastly, just taking care of your physical health in ways that help to promote resilience to hormonal changes is just another change that can help to smooth some of the transitions that women have as they cycle between their hormonal changes.
Love it. Well, everybody, the book is The Period Brain, The New Science of Why We PMS and How to Fix It by Dr. Sarah E. Hill. Sarah, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, and everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.